Drive down the wrong road outside the wrong school at the wrong time of day now, and a camera you probably never noticed will have your number plate before you've even slowed down. No barrier, no person standing in the road, just a fine landing at your address a few weeks later. Let's get into exactly how these zones actually work, which mistake genuinely carries a 200-pound fine, and what parents and drivers doing the school run need to actually check before their next drop-off. These are called school streets, and if you haven't encountered one yet, you almost certainly will soon, because councils across the country have been rolling them out at a genuinely rapid pace, often faster than local news coverage has kept up with. The concept itself is simple. For a set window at the start and end of the school day, usually somewhere between 30 and 90 minutes, the road directly outside a school closes to most motor traffic entirely. No cars driving through, no dropping off right at the gate. The idea being that kids walking, scooting, or cycling to school don't have to do it weaving between vehicles, queuing bumper to bumper right outside the playground. Here's where it stops being a soft suggestion and becomes something with real financial teeth. A growing number of these school streets are enforced with automatic number plate recognition cameras, positioned at the entry and exit points, running exactly during those operational windows. Drive into the zone without a registered exemption while the camera is live, and that's an offense under the Traffic Management Act 2004, triggering a penalty charge notice automatically, with absolutely no officer needing to see it happen. The exact fine amount does vary depending on which council you're in, but the figures reported across schemes this year commonly sit around £130, dropping to roughly half that if you pay within 14 days, though some boroughs have set theirs as high as £160 before the early payment discount applies. What genuinely surprises a lot of parents is how new schemes are often introduced. Rather than issuing fines from day one, several councils are running an initial trial period, typically around 6 months, where a first contravention only generates a warning letter, with an actual penalty only kicking in on repeat offenses. That's a genuinely useful grace period if your local scheme has just launched, but it's exactly the kind of detail that catches people out later, because that warning period isn't permanent. Once a scheme moves from experimental trial to a confirmed, ongoing restriction, the warning letters stop, and full enforcement begins from the very first contravention. Now, who's actually exempt from all this? Because it isn't a blanket ban on every vehicle in the country. Residents living inside the school street boundary can typically register up to a handful of household vehicles for exemption. Blue badge holders visiting a property inside the zone can apply too, as can care workers, medical staff, and in a lot of boroughs, taxis serving an address within the closed area. Emergency vehicles are automatically exempt without needing to register anything. Critically though, having a general residence parking permit for the wider area, or even a valid blue badge on its own, does not automatically cover you inside a school street. These are entirely separate permissions, and assuming one covers the other is one of the most common reasons genuinely well-meaning drivers end up with a fine they didn't see coming. Here's a detail that trips up an enormous number of drivers specifically, because it sounds like it should make sense but genuinely doesn't work the way people assume, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. If you're already parked inside a school street before the restriction period actually starts, you're generally permitted to leave during the closure. Vehicles already present when the camera activates aren't typically penalized for exiting. But driving in during the active window itself, even briefly, even just to drop off your own child at the gate for 30 seconds, is treated exactly the same as any other unauthorized entry. Parents doing exactly what these schemes are designed to reduce, driving right up to the school gate, are consistently among the drivers most commonly caught by these cameras, precisely because the old habit of pulling right up to the entrance is the single behavior the whole scheme exists to change. Let's talk about the figure actually sitting in the title of this video, because it deserves proper explanation rather than just being thrown out as a scare number. £200 isn't typically the school street camera penalty itself. That sits lower, as we've covered. Where £200 genuinely and precisely applies is mobile phone use while driving. And this becomes acutely relevant during the school run specifically because of how much is happening in that 30-second window outside the gates. Checking a message while crawling forward in a drop-off queue, glancing at a map while looking for parking, taking a call while your engine is still running near the school entrance, all of it counts as using a handheld device while driving if your vehicle is in motion at all, even inching forward at walking pace. The penalty is exactly £200 and 6 penalty points. And if you're a newly qualified driver within your first 2 years, 6 points isn't a fine you absorb and move on from, it's your license revoked entirely, with no court appearance required to make that happen. Idling is worth covering here too, because school gates are specifically where councils have been enforcing this most aggressively this year. Rule 123 of the Highway Code prohibits leaving your engine running unnecessarily while stationary, and while the baseline national fine sits at £20, doubling to £40 if unpaid, a growing list of councils have introduced their own stricter penalty notices specifically targeting school zones, with some reaching as high as £80. Sitting with the engine running while you wait in a queue outside the school, even for what feels like a couple of harmless minutes, is exactly the scenario these patrols are watching for, and enforcement officers are increasingly stationed at school gates during pickup and drop-off, specifically because that's where the complaints about air quality and idling concentrate most heavily. There's also the more traditional parking side of school zone enforcement worth knowing, because it's existed for years but is being watched far more closely now that councils have invested in these wider zone schemes. Parking on the yellow zigzag markings directly outside a school, known as the School Keep Clear Zone, carries its own penalty charge notice, typically in a similar range to the School Street contraventions, and it's enforced regardless of whether the wider road has a School Street restriction on it at all. These markings exist specifically to keep sightlines clear for children crossing, and enforcement here has genuinely tightened, with more councils now using dedicated camera cars specifically patrolling School Keep Clear zones during term time, rather than relying purely on parking wardens physically present at the right moment. Something worth flagging honestly, because a lot of coverage on this topic overstates it, is that school streets are not enforced every single day of the year regardless of circumstances. Camera enforcement is specifically tied to term time and normal school hours, meaning during holidays and half-terms, the restriction signs typically remain up, but ANPR enforcement is switched off, since councils aren't required to formally close the scheme during those periods, even though nobody's actually driving into an active restriction. If you're navigating an unfamiliar area during a school holiday and see School Street signage, it's still worth checking the specific operational dates on the signage itself, rather than assuming enforcement is definitely paused, because the exact policy does vary between individual schemes and councils. It's worth understanding how these cameras actually differ from the ones you might already be familiar with from bus lanes or box junctions, because School Street cameras work slightly differently in practice. Some schemes use fixed ANPR units mounted at the entry and exit points of the closed road, running continuously during operational hours. Others rely on mobile CCTV camera cars, which councils can move between different school streets on a rotating basis, meaning a road that wasn't actively monitored last month could genuinely have enforcement in place today. This mobility is deliberate, spreading limited enforcement resources across a growing number of schemes rather than requiring a permanent fixed camera at every single site. But it also means assuming a particular school street is usually not watched, based on past experience, is exactly the kind of outdated assumption that catches drivers out. Exemption applications themselves are worth getting sorted well before you actually need them, rather than waiting until the morning you realize you're going to be driving through a zone. Most councils run these through an online portal specifically for School Street exemptions, separate entirely from any controlled parking zone permit system, and processing isn't always instant, sometimes taking several working days to confirm and register your vehicle against the camera's exemption list. If you've just moved into a school street boundary, or a new scheme has just launched near an address you regularly visit, applying as early as possible avoids a gap where you're technically entitled to an exemption, but the system hasn't caught up yet, during which a camera would still flag your plate as unauthorized. So let's bring all of this together into something you can actually use on your next school run. If you're driving through an unfamiliar area near a school during term time, particularly during the 30 to 90-minute windows either side of normal school hours, watch for School Street signage specifically, because a camera enforcing it may be active even without a visible barrier or person in the road. Don't assume a residence permit or a blue badge automatically covers you inside a school street. They're separate permissions requiring separate registration. Keep the phone completely out of reach the moment your vehicle is moving at all, even at walking pace in a queue, because that 200-pound penalty and 6 points apply regardless of how slowly you're actually going. Switch the engine off if you're waiting rather than leaving it idling, particularly right outside the school gates where enforcement patrols are increasingly concentrated. Never park on the yellow zigzags, even for what feels like 30 seconds to drop something off, because that's one of the most consistently enforced parking contraventions in the entire country. And if a school street exists near a school you regularly visit, apply for any exemption you're entitled to well ahead of time, rather than assuming you'll sort it out on the day you actually need it. None of this is designed to make the school run feel like navigating a minefield. These schemes exist because the roads directly outside schools were, for years, genuinely dangerous during pickup and drop-off, with children weaving through queued traffic that shouldn't have been there in the first place. The overwhelming majority of parents and drivers who understand where these zones are and what they actually require never see a penalty at all. But the pattern here is identical to nearly everything else we cover. No dramatic national headline, no single announcement covering every school in the country. Just a scheme that quietly appears on your usual route, enforced by a camera you may not have consciously registered was even there. It's worth ending on the actual reasoning behind why councils have leaned so heavily into this particular approach, because it helps explain why the enforcement is unlikely to loosen going forward, rather than tighten further. Road safety data collected from early school street schemes has consistently shown measurable reductions in traffic volume directly outside participating schools during operational hours, alongside reported improvements in air quality readings taken at the school gate itself. For councils already under pressure to hit air quality targets and reduce child pedestrian casualties near schools, that data makes school streets one of the cheaper, faster interventions available compared to physical road redesigns, which is exactly why the number of schemes has grown so quickly over such a short period, rather than staying limited to a handful of pilot locations. If this helped you understand exactly what these zones require and where the real 200-pound risk actually sits, hit subscribe, because more of these schemes are launching through the rest of the year, and I'll keep covering exactly what parents and drivers need to know. Whether it's a new school street appearing on your usual route, a keep clear zone getting a fresh camera car patrol, or enforcement simply tightening around an existing scheme once its trial period ends, the direction of travel is consistent, more of this, not less, and staying ahead of it is genuinely just a matter of knowing where to look. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.